Mr. Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure to chair the opening discussion of this year's edition of the Prague European Summit. The title of our panel is 1989, 2004, 2019, Different Faces of Europe. And I think it's actually quite good to talk about faces of Europe, because we often talk about challenges which are in front of Europe. And there are many challenges. Yesterday, we finished the process of European elections, which totally changed the rules of the European Parliament's politics. Inside the EU, we have countries that want to leave, and they cannot do it. We have outside the EU, we have countries that want to come to join us, and they cannot do it. It seems that leaving is as difficult as joining today. We have, on the world stage, we have several rivals, and these rivals are ambitious. We do have also allies, but these allies are difficult. And sometimes they are that difficult that one can ask whether they are not turning into rivals. But this panel should go beyond challenges and to look into the faces. What does it mean, faces? European Union is not a human being, so it does not have a face. But it has a certain manner in which it presents itself, in which it is perceived by others. And when we talk about faces, we can use indeed the 3 dates which are in the title, 89, 2004, 2019. For me, each of these faces can be summarized by one word. 1989, it's enthusiasm. It was the moment of liberation. We were intoxicated with the new liberty, and the West Europe was also very happy about this. 2004, it's still optimism, because 2004 these countries joined the European Union. So we were less enthusiastic than in the 1990s, so we got into touch with reality, and we kept our optimism. Now in 2019, I wouldn't say that the majority feeling or the majority faces optimism. It's perhaps disappointment, disenchantment, not just in Central Europe, in the old EU countries as well. So the question is whether this is real, whether everybody agrees on that, or whether there are other faces which may be discovered during the discussion. However, when we talk about faces of Europe, we can talk about geographical faces, because Europe is it's a continent, it's rich. And you can have very different perspective of Europe depending on where you are. Some people in the last year talked about the differences between the West and the East. I think it's rather misleading, because there is no Western face or Western perspective of the EU, and there is no Eastern or Central European perspective of the EU. Each capital, each country has a different perspective. And when we talk about differences, we shouldn't forget about the North and South. And I don't say that there is a northern perspective or northern face of the European Union and the southern. But there are differences inside the north, inside the south. There are differences all around. Good policy and good politics is able to overcome these differences. But perhaps to overcome them, we need also to talk about them. So that's definitely a possible topic for the discussion of today. So as you see, we have actually a lot of questions to address, and I am really happy that we have such good speakers who will help us to reflect on these issues. So let me start with our host, Tomáš Petříček. Mr. Petříček is the Foreign Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czech Republic. He used to be also the Vice Minister, Deputy Minister of Social Affairs. He has rich experience as the senior advisor in the European Parliament, and he has also experience from the municipal politics, especially here in Prague. Welcome. Our next speaker is Madame Anna Palacio. Madame Palacio is a regular participant at the Prague European Summit, so probably she doesn't need to be introduced, but despite that, let me say a few words. Madame Palacio served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, 2002-2004. She was also a member of the Spanish Parliament. She has a rich experience from the European Parliament. She served as the Senior Vice President of the World Bank Group. and she is also a member of a number of committees and advisory groups, such as Scientific Council of the Real Institute Elcano, Council of the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Executive Board of the Atlantic Council. She's member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council. So I know that I sort of didn't address all of these. And she is also, which is a special pride to us, on the board of the Prague European Summit. Thank you for reminding me of that. Welcome. Next on our list is Madame Reka Šemerkény. She is now Executive Vice President of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. Before that, she served as Hungarian ambassador to Washington, and before that, she was Chief Advisor in Foreign and Security Policy to Prime Minister Orbán. But Madame Šemerkény has also a rich experience from the private sector, because you served also as the Senior Advisor to the Chairman and the CEO of the MOL Group, which is an energy giant in Hungary. Last but not least, Pavel Svieboda. Pavel Svieboda is Deputy Head of the European Policy Strategy Center, which is an in-house think tank of the European Commission, reporting directly to the President of the European Commission. Pavel has also rich experience from Poland, because he was President of Demos Europe, which is a think tank based in Warsaw. But Pavel has also experience from the official structure. He used to be the director of the EU department at the time when Poland joined the European Union. And before that, he was the advisor to the president, to the Polish president. If I'm not wrong, it was Mr. Kwaśniewski at that time. All of our speakers, as you can see, all of our speakers are transversal in the sense that they have experience from a variety of domains. It's politics, it's higher administration, but it's also academic sphere. All of them have experience with teaching, all of them experience with research. That's why I believe that this debate will be quite vivid. And just to put some limits to our debate and to the vividity, which are not my limits, but the organizers' limits, because we are supposed to end in 1 hour about, all the participants were kind enough to accept that they will start with the opening statements, which will last 7 minutes. And after these opening statements, we will have a short, brief exchange at the panel, and then we will open to the audience. I was also told that everyone who wants to ask the question can do it via website, and all these questions, I will be able to see these questions and ask them, pose them to our guests. So that would be for the introduction. Thank you very much for coming, and with no longer delays, I would like to give floor to Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I have to admit that it is not an easy task to find a single word definition for each of the years we are discussing. And if I start with 1989, I think that the proper word would be change. We felt not only in the streets or at our homes that something was changing. I was 8 years old, and even I was aware that something substantial is changing, and it is not only the way I address my teacher, but it is in a way how the society started to breathe. I think we can agree that it was all up in the air. In addition, if you look up the date of 1989, either on the internet or in books and articles on the subject, the term change has been clearly dominant in most of cases. And I believe that rightly so. From the purely Czech perspective, I would even give it an explanatory subtitle. We knew that something was changing, we knew what was right, and we had fresh dreams at the time. In 1989, we knew what was the dark side. We toppled, and we knew what what we would like to replace it with, and basically it was with freedom. What I would like to underline as an important message today is the following. The vast majority of us Czechs were united behind one objective: to live freely. We were curious to discover different facets of freedom. We were passionate about it. We wanted to live in a free world. And part of it was also the desire for accession to both NATO and the EU, which, in my opinion, represent twin inseparable major objectives of our foreign policy that relate both wider public as well as elites behind them. So replacing the Eastern vector by the Euro-Atlantic vector in our foreign policy represents another way of looking at 1989, looking at the change 1989 represents. I think what would be also an inspiration for many is the way the change took place. In 1989, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians proposed a new model of regime change, what we call Velvet Revolution, have similar names in Hungarian, Polish, because we challenge the notion of inherent bloodshed associated with the word of regime change. Instead of violence, our revolutions offered people power and negotiations as a way of solving our problems. And later it inspired color revolutions in Eastern Europe. And we have another Velvet Revolution now in Armenia. What I think year 1989 did not change was human nature. I think that this is where the change was not taking place. On another date, 2004, us joining European Union, more or less we achieved the main objective we set up in 1989 to return back to Europe, and membership of the European Union symbolized the fact we returned to Europe. And if I to say one word, I think that with it came responsibility. So 2004, in my opinion, I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with the headphone. 2004 represent responsibility because it was not only about us getting new rights as a members of European Union, but also we freely adopted many responsibilities and commitments. I would probably name some of them, because the assumption of more responsibility, for instance, manifested itself in shifting from being the recipient of development aid to becoming donor country. In 2004, we offered that we can provide the experience of our transition from state-controlled economy to market economy, from authoritarian regime to democracy to others, and we launched the transition program, which until today represents an important trademark of our foreign policy. It was our turn to share our know-how. Another huge task for us was the preparation for the first EU presidency. I don't want to be judgmental on whether we succeeded or not, but all member states that joined in 2004 took over this responsibility and showed that our commitment to European integration is very strong. So, in general, I think that with 2004, we take a lot of responsibilities for how our union look like. When it comes to 2019, Mr. Durack spoke about dissolution. I would say that it's my reading more about uncertainty. If I were to express the current situation, I would use a comparison with a coin toss before it lands. You still do not know if it's going to be heads or tails. You know only thing that the outcome is uncertain. We are shortly after the European elections, in which the Central European voters voted for the fourth time. I'm also glad that we have a much higher turnout than last time, which expressed increased interest about European integration, European Union. And maybe it was also a reflection of the conflict that is now emerging in Europe. And this is the association with the uncertainty. What I strongly believe, however, is that the makers will, at the end, outnumber the breakers. We see that in the European Parliament, the makers still represent the majority. And even dissenters, I think, should be able to present alternatives to current policies. Hopefully, the coming weeks will give us some hints as to what extent the political groups in the Parliament will be able to work together towards brighter future for European Union. What I'm concerned, however, is that we are losing a little bit of faith in the European ability to shape the world to its liking. We got used too much to living in a crisis mentality and still did not get over it. From within, I can feel fatigue, lack of true friendship, partnership among the member states, weak European identity, many regional or other types of rivalries, Visegrad Group versus Western Europe, South versus North, EU member states versus European institutions, and we can name it many others. Furthermore, I feel that we lost the joint drive we had in the past. We do not have a European dream, a joint objective we want to achieve. To use another example, we have been like a boat in the middle of the sea, calling Mayday, but not realizing that we can retake control over the steering wheel. Yet, I believe it is still in our reach. And on the outside, we see many challenges. Resurgent Russia, more assertive China, which is flexing its muscles and supports its vision of the world through economic means. We see complicated allies. And last but not least, we see many challenges in our direct neighborhood. Instead of a belt of shared values and institutions, we both in our southern and eastern neighborhood see instability and violence. In conclusion, I would like to offer a provocative set of questions for this panel. Today, the question before us Europeans is this: can we recapture some of the strategic boldness and historical imagination of 1989? Or shall we now leave it to others to shape the world who pretend to be morally, militarily or technologically more advanced than us? I think these are two questions that we need to respond to if we want to change the 2019 from a year of uncertainty to a year of strategic certainty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for summarizing these 3 years as change, responsibility, and uncertainty. And let me give floor to Madame Palacio.
Well, thank you. First of all, and I know that time is a scarce commodity, but it's thank you for a fantastically well-organized conference as usual, and it's a pleasure for me to be part of the board. And I will start by highlighting what the minister has said about dialogue. I think that this conference represents a fruitful dialogue, and my presence coming from Spain just highlights how there is no south and east and north, as our moderator has just said. Now, I will start by saying how I was traveling and I had my office calling me and saying, well, you are on a panel that says the 1989, 2004, 2019 different phases of Europe. And I understood phases PHAS, phases, and I thought, that's interesting. It's first phase from 89 to 2004, construction, and maybe second phase, 2004 to 2019, deconstruction. That's interesting. Then I realized that it was phases FACE. And just I take your challenge. For me, the face of the European citizen in 1989 was self-confidence. Everything was possible. This was the year where there was no limit to the ambitions. 2004, the image I have is wholeness. At last, Europe one, free, and at peace. This idea of, I don't know if it's satisfaction, but it's wholeness. And today, it's on the line of what the minister said, I think it's anxiety. But having said that and responded to your, and I don't have to explain why, anxiety, because it's anxiety all over the European Union. I will go back to this idea of phases, PHAS. And if you take this approach, I would say that 1989 is the unleashing, the opening. 2004 is the turning point. And today we are seeing the closing. So I will just be brief and take for each of these dates three strands. Europeans, institutions, and geopolitics. Of course, 1989, Europeans is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the fall of the Berlin Wall just is unification, the possibility of the unification of Germany, first and foremost. And second, the possibility of the reunification of Europe, so the enlargement. I think that 1989, it's also the Kohl-Mitterrand agreement that would say, well, unification of Germany, just the euro as a counterbalance, and the Treaty of Maastricht. 1989, in terms of institutions, is the middle of the Delors, the great Delors Commission, the great creation. 89 is the year when the report on what would be the euro, on the monetary union, was published. So we are there. There is this ambition of completing the internal market, of the four freedoms going forward. And this is what signals and what really marked the next 15 years until 2004. And in geopolitics, of course, in geopolitics is the end of the Cold War. It's Europe is not any longer the theater of operations. It's not any longer just an object Europe just can look at itself and just think of being an actor separate and distinct from the US. And of course, the period that followed after the Balkan War, we saw the limits that this had and this idea of soft power and all that. But in '89, there is still this idea that Europe can be. So 2004, turning point. These forces that were unleashed in '89 just come to fruition in 2004 on Europeans. 2004 marks 10 years after the unification. Just Germany becomes a normal member state that just looks for its interest, not as until then Germany would look for the German interest within the European Union interest. Germany after 2004, it's a different Germany. It's a leading Germany. It's a reluctant leader. As Minister Sikorski of Poland put it so well. I think that one of the manifestations of this leadership is the push for the fifth enlargement. The fifth enlargement is an enlargement to the difference to the enlargement to Spain and Portugal. It's an enlargement that Germany wanted and Germany pushed forward. And this scale and ambition of this enlargement just marks something is that in this just alternative of widening or deepening, Germany marked it. It was widening. It would not be deepening, and this marked the following period. In the institutional, of course, 2004 marks the signature and the signature of the European Constitution, this ambition of the European Constitution. So it's the peak and before the demise of this idea of an ambitious institution building of the European Union, this transcendence to the legitimacy that would go to the citizens, this idea of just making a leap, a qualitative leap in terms of institution. Of course, this marked a difference. So 2004 is there, but we know that in 2005, this is not going to happen. Now, in geopolitics, of course, in geopolitics, there is Iraq. And the first thing that Iraq produces in Europe is a division. The Atlantists and those that wanted that the European Union would be counterpower or counterweight or counter something to the European Union. And this has had consequences in many areas, because this was this idea of kind of, I wouldn't say non-aligned, but soft power. This is the moment where Europe pushes forward the soft power, Europe, continental Europe, because we have to remember always that there were more member states aligned with United States, so Atlantists, than there were continentals, but it was an important issue. Now, 2019, it's the closing. It's a closing in terms of we Europeans. We have stopped, and the minister has said it very well. We have stopped enlargement, but we have also stopped deepening, and we have faced 10 years ago a big crisis that just showed us how we needed institutions, how we needed to push forward. Yet we haven't. And where we are today is in an intergovernmental Europe that is very different from the Europe of 2004 and from 1989. And of course, we are in this Europe where we don't any longer believe that this is an inexorable path forward, that there will be different speeds. Now we know that it's not irreversible, that there has been Brexit if it ever happens, but that we have lost this assurance that this was a project where we would go at different speeds, different ways, but we all were walking in the same direction. We are at a moment where we really miss institutions. We miss this push forward. Now, in terms of the transatlantic relationship, I would just limit to say that it's a strained relationship, that we still see in the world that the United States is the indispensable power, but today is an indispensable power that is just not having, and I conclude. Now, I think that we all know what I'm meaning by this, and I conclude. So 2019 marks this closing of a period of tectonic changes, tectonic moves that have marked the last 30 years. We are in a Germany reluctantly led Europe, dominated by states, by member states, and not European institutions, with a transatlantic relationship under strain and desperately in need of institutional reform and construction to regain buy-in from citizens. This is the beginning of a new period, a new parliament, soon a new commission, and we will see in 30 years there will be others just discussing about the faces and the phases of the European Union. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Madame Palacio, and I appreciate your trinity of self-confidence, wholeness, and anxiety characterizing the 3 years. Now I would like to give floor to Madame Shemerkeni.
Thank you so much, and I really wanted to thank you and congratulate the organizers for putting this incredible event together. I'm honored to be here with the Minister, and I think it's a wonderful and very important opportunity to really think through some of the most important questions of what's going to define our next decade, 2 decades probably. I was there in 1990, the first time, the elections in Central Europe, very much in the midst of everything that was happening, and I remember the feeling that every decision that we were making, or lack of decisions that we were not making, we were sure that they were going to impact our lives for the next decades. And indeed, that is what happened. So we laid down the foundations, and then for 20 years, 30 years now, we were following those paths, and now we're in a similarly fundamentally strategic moment in our history in which decisions that we make or decisions that we are not going to make are going to define the next 2 or 3 decades. This is why I believe anniversaries are so important. A strategic analysis is very important for us to understand at a time of a serious historic anniversary, because these anniversaries really force decision makers and analysts, obviously, to go deeper and to look longer than tomorrow, to try to seek the trends and take a critical look to understand, have we achieved what we set to ourselves? And if not, then how to go forward, how to reorient our actions. If we take a look at this discussion scenery today, we can see that the political discourse in Europe and about Europe in the rest of the world is full of negative connotations and a lot of criticisms and a lot of concerns. It's striking to compare this with 1989, the first phase, as our organizers termed it. The face of Europe is very different was very different in 1989 to that of today. It was full of optimism, it was full of confidence, it was victorious, it was full of values. If we compare this with the face, for instance, of what happened just before 1989, what resulted the optimism, the confidence, the self-assurance of Europeans at the time, Russia. Well, what we can see is that a post-Soviet Russia looks a lot more similar to the Soviet Russia of before 1990 than Europe in comparison in the same time frame. This triumph of the West, of democracy, of our values that we saw, the big bang of democracies, as we used to call them, really influenced decisions, values, institutions, and our shaping of the institutions at the same time. So I would agree that the first phase is incredibly important. That was this accomplishment of the strategic goals. NATO enlargement and EU enlargement happening by 2004, enlarging, fundamentally shifting geostrategically the viewpoints and the positions. What happens ever since is the phase that I think gives a historic pressure to all of us. This is the phase when we have to understand that membership and institutions in and of themselves are not the end goal. They are the tools to go forward and to promote our values and to promote our interests as well. If we put this European sort of search for a way into a larger context, is the only way for us to understand why these decisions are so important that we're doing. Because Europe is now coming to terms to understanding really that this happy and quiet period in which international crises were kindly going above our heads, targeting the United States, hitting Washington and getting the Americans sort of focused on this, is over. International crises are attacking Europe, putting Europe under pressure. They are not avoiding us anymore. And so this international global development is a fundamentally defining feature of whatever is happening to and in the continent. This is why I find very important that I can be here with you from the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. I think it's a very fundamentally important moment. We have had 2 decades of parallel talk. Europe was having one channel of discussion on most issues, and these discussions were held in all the European frameworks. And then mostly the same decision makers were having a parallel discussion series with Washington or with the other transatlantic partners, in almost as if the 2 talks were having no connection to each other, no link to each other, no effect on each other. That, I think, is over. What we have to see is that these international pressures that are hitting Europe and that are now understandably and clearly there have an impact. What is the future going to look like? And that, I think, is fundamentally important for us to understand how we have to respond inside Europe and in the transatlantic framework. What we can see is now that this phase of optimistic and benign, happy, sort of in-between era is over. The 21st century has begun. Like the 20th century ended in 1989 with the end of the Cold War and the first free elections in Central East Europe and the geostrategic shift that resulted from this 10 years before the sort of real end of the century. The 21st century also did not start in 2000. It started maybe with the 3 fundamental developments that I think are going to be visible and pressuring us in our decisions. The first one was 9/11. That was the first instance when it was obviously clear that there can be groups independent of states that can have a power that can actually compete and even be larger than those of the states. We knew that from globalization, that multinational companies have a special, place in our decision making that need and necessitate the cooperation of the states. We knew also that there are a whole range of actors, from global media to civil organizations, but we had to add terrorist groups to that. So that is, I think, the first characteristic that will be defining the 21st century. The second was the migration wave that hit Europe in 2015. That is a pressure on the continent that shows in concreto what the uneven development in globalization means and how much this can distort and how much this cannot be kept separate from developments in the rest of the world. That is a pressure that I believe we have to face in the next decades in a cooperative way. And the third defining element of the global scene is the rise of China and the increasing presence of China in the international global discussions, which is why what we have to talk about is, as a beginning of the 21st century sort of defining characteristics, is that we are back in the great power competition with Russia and China rising and having an impact on Europe. All of these big challenges necessitate one important thing, which I think is something we have to add into our discussion, is that none of these are solvable either by the EU or nation states of the EU alone, nor by the United States. We need a fundamental cooperation in all of these big challenges if we want to be able to preserve our values and to go forward along and to be able to develop the proper answers that were asked from the minister. Do we have the will and the drive to develop structures and cooperations that strengthen our values? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And I give floor to Pavel Svěboda.
Thank you very much, Pat. Since I'm the last speaker and I saw some very interesting questions already from the audience on Slido, I will allow myself to refer to those. But you ask about the three words that come to our minds with respect to the three critical dates, 89, 2004, 2019. And in fact, I have one word, which is democracy. Because it's at the heart of what happened in 89, for obvious reasons. That was the miracle of freedom. It was at the heart of what happened in 2004 as well, because it was, after all, a democratic and sovereign decision of countries that acceded, that they want to join the project. And yesterday we witnessed a huge festival of democracy all across Europe on an unprecedented scale and with unprecedented degree of emotion. So I put forward democracy. And if I were to travel in time a little bit, I think what we probably could have done in this region better after '89 is to focus on the institutions of democracy and the institutions of the rule of law. The question came up on the screen about Poland, Hungary, and Romania and the rule of law, what's going to happen. And in fact, this commission will, in a few weeks' time, make new proposals on how to strengthen the rule of law mechanism. And this is evidence of how seriously this commission treats this fundamental question. But if we were to travel in time, I think much more emphasis could have been put on these issues. We were so focused on the economic transformation. No wonder, I mean, the communist system became bankrupt economically, first of all, and on top of that politically. But we could have spent much more time on this organic work, strengthening rule of law. 2004, again, if I had one wish to make, to top what has been an unprecedented project, it's for this to be more of a two-way street between East and West. I think we had an opportunity for 2004 to be a date when Europe would be reconstituted afresh, in a way in which the ownership of the project, this side of the European Union, would be much stronger as a result. Well, yesterday I think was a spectacular day in all dimensions, and it proved that we are in this age of heightened participation. I think participation is really what people want to show nowadays. I mean, in 9 member states, the turnout was the highest ever. We had the highest turnout since 20 years ago, but also in 9 member states, it was the highest ever in European elections. And when you look at the design, yes, there are different actors in entering the parliament, but there is a new center emerging, a new political center, and the extremes are being contained. we obviously have no synchronization of the politics in Europe across the member states. It's more like a mosaic of national stories and national theaters. Sinatra, when he sang his My Way song, was probably a precursor of this situation. But Europe and what goes on in the European Union is going to be a unifying common denominator. I think we should also realize how deep the transformation of the political scenes is in a number of member states. And on the face of it, we have fragmentation. And fragmentation has its upsides and downsides. I think it has its upsides because people feel more connected, they feel more part of the process, and has its downsides because you need to manage fragmentation. But there are ways. There are ways to make sure that coalitions emerge and that agreement is made. So there was a question about whom out of the Spitzenkandidaten we would endorse in the panel. Well, the truth of the matter is that there's going to be a vote in the European Council, and whoever thinks that he or she is capable of pulling together a majority needs to win that vote, and then there's going to be a vote in the Parliament. So there will need to be a coalition in place. Is that better or worse than the previous situation? I mean, it's different. I think we shouldn't necessarily prejudge that it's going to be more complicated. It is going to be more complicated, but also perhaps new avenues will open up because of this more diverse nature of the coalition in place. I think the institutions will need to act as a stabilizer, and that is the European Commission, that is the European Parliament. I think yesterday was a big endorsement of the European Parliament in terms of the turnout. But obviously expectations will need to be also quite cautiously and delicately squared. So we have come up with this list of 5 areas at the European Commission for the discussion of the leaders in June at the June European Council, when the strategic agenda will be discussed. And these 5 areas are protection, growth, fairness, sustainability, and influence in the world. And you can look into these areas from the point of view areas from the point of view of whether they will generate agreement or whether they will generate a division. I think they will generate a lot more agreement than meets the eye, because these are the existential challenges that all the member states face. In a way, the Union is moving out of the line of fire politically, of the most sensitive issues, and focusing on the more existential challenges. Hence the term European sovereignty was coined by President Macron and then President Juncker in their speeches, because it expresses this dimension of big existential challenges that we all have to face. And under the surface, there will be the political battles intensifying probably rather than not. And I will finish by saying that all this is important, but it's also no time for introversion. Because if you look at these 3 dates, 89, 2004, and now 2019, what they have also managed to do is they have absorbed our attention to such a degree that we have missed out on a couple of things going on in the world. China's rise is obvious, it has been mentioned, and it's likely to continue, even though in somewhat modulated fashion. In 2025, for example, China will overtake our joint defense spending in Europe. Something to bear in mind, Africa will double its population by 2050. I mean, these are the big tectonic shifts going on elsewhere in the world. And the fundamentals of that have to do with economic growth. And economic growth needs its agents. It needs agents of value creation. And there, when we look at 2004, 2005, there was only one technological firm among top 10 in the world. Now there are 7 technological firms. None of them is European. So we have a lot on the agenda to cater for, but I would say there is definitely no time. This is definitely no time for introversion.
Thank you, Pavel. Now we open the door for the discussion. I will abandon my questions because there are so many questions coming from you. And given the fact that the Prague European Summit is sort of a democratic institution, there is a question which is endorsed by 16 people. That's the first question. So I would like to invite our panelists to think about it. The question is, can we expect the EU to survive another 15 years if it doesn't urgently deal with the problems regarding the rule of law in Hungary, Poland and Romania? But I will also use my role of the chair to add to this question a sample sub-question, which is, can we expect the EU to survive another 15 years if it deals with the problems regarding the rule of law only in Hungary, Poland and Romania and not elsewhere in Europe? So I just wonder whether you would take issue you would share your wisdom on the questions or the two questions which are phrased like that. Can we start with you, Mr. Minister?
I think that we have underestimated during our debate about the future of Europe that the European integration is based on sharing common values, and that these values are fundamental for operation of the Union. So European Union express more or less the values itself. So in my understanding, yes, there is a danger if we start questioning the basic values on which the European Union is founded, that the integration, there might be a reversal in European integration. And what I feel is bigger danger is not that we will totally reverse the values. We'll start to redefine the values themselves. And this is probably a bigger threat, redefinition of the values, or how we understand the values. The thing about, for example, democracy. I have to admit that I have a problem that we now need to put abbreviation to what we mean by democracy. We are now speaking about liberal democracy. In 1989, we wanted democracy, and we all understood what we mean by the word democracy. And the fact that we have to include one word before democracy is to some extent symbolic to the change in a way how we approach the common values we have in Europe. So I think that yes, there is a danger, and the danger is also that we will apply and we will try to enforce the rules only from some member states. And I think that this is the addition.
Thank you. Thank you. Madame Palacio.
Well, I will start by the second question, which I think is easier. YouGov has conducted a survey with the European Council on Foreign Relations and another institution. And a majority of respondents said, without any other qualification, that they anticipated a possible EU collapse within the next 10 to 20 years. And this was a survey conducted not in all, but in 15 of the member states, and there was a majority. So again, there is this idea of uncertainty, of just that is permeating everywhere. Now, Minister, the values are in Article 2. Why do I say that the values are in Article 2? Because our construction is a construction by law, with law, and this is the treaty, this is the framework that we have accepted. So, okay, these values in Article 2, you may interpret them in a way, and I may interpret them in a slightly, not much different, but slightly different way. But we have accepted, because of the treaty, that the opinion that counts is the opinion of the Court of Justice of the European Union. So this is my response. Now, there are certain issues, which is the independence of the judiciary. There is no question that this is one of the pillars, one of the foundational pillars of the rule of law, simply just qualifying the rule of law in the European Union. And this goes as an implicit answer to what you have asked. But as I said, what is important about our construction is that we have the judges. We may discuss, and we have to discuss, and we have to interact, and there are issues, not these three where I think it's clear, but on issues that are dividing us, like for instance, immigration, where this is a different question. This is a matter that we have to discuss. But on the independence of the judiciary, this is clearly stated, and we will have rulings, I hope, soon, that will clarify this in some of the member states that were mentioned.
Thank you. Madam Semerkeni.
Well, I'm coming from Washington, and as an American organization which covers and focuses on strengthening the relationship between Central Europe and the United States, it is hugely bothering to see a European discussion which weakens the cooperation on the transatlantic level. And I really would like to underline that this is a number one priority, because all of these major challenges that we can foresee for the next 2 decades to come are every one of them individually capable of destroying the entire Western cooperation and value system. All of them combined is definitely a major strategic problem. But I would like to say that I think it's a moment of very sensitive moment of a need, when there is a need to taking a deep breath, taking one step back, and try to refocus on a discussion instead of a continuous fight. What is very important, as what can be seen, is that the discussion is about democracy and Europe in general. And I believe very much that these are the foundations that we have to promote and we have to support in our transatlantic dialogue as well.
Thank you. Pavel Svoboda.
Yes, I would agree with the minister that we need a better understanding of each other when it comes to values, because we come from different points of view, we have different experience. But having said that, there are certain red lines, and these red lines we have to simply recognize. And as Anna Palatia mentioned, independence of the judiciary is one of them, for obvious reasons. I mean, the entire system, the entire legal system of the European Union is built on that basis. It's a community of law, after all. And by the way, everybody needs to subscribe to them. There have been rulings of the European Court of Justice this week with regards to Germany and the independence of the public prosecutor in issuing European arrest warrants. So it's not the case that someone is under particular spotlight. I mean, yes, there are these red lines being crossed in Central Europe, in some countries, because we shouldn't put everybody in that basket either. And the question to me is when will governments in these countries realize what they are actually doing? Will they realize early enough, or will they realize only when the consequences to the countries concerned will be felt? And of course, one solution has huge advantage over the other. No need to elaborate on that. And I think we haven't wasted the past 3 years, by the way. I think there has been, there's a lot of mutual suspicion in the debate, some cynicism as well, but I think we have also used these 3 years for a good use on the rule of law within Article 7 procedures as well, within the infringement procedures that have been launched. I think there is a realization that you cannot play around with rule of law in the European Union.
Thank you. One of the questions which are actually raised by the audience and which corresponds to what Minister Petříček talked about is, will the EU ever be able to project hard power? Because you talked about the moment of strategic boldness. whether we are at this moment. So my question is, I mean, the previous question was very much about inside the EU. Now the question is the outside of the EU. Are we able to project hard power? Is it desirable? Can we do it? If so, when, how? Why didn't we do it so far? Would you start?
Thank you. If I may just for clarification, I think we are in agreement here. What I'm concerned about is that not only breaking the values or just giving up on values is a problem. One of the problems is redefining the values. On hard power projection, there is a lot of debate about whether EU should have more muscles to project more of its interest in its neighborhood. I believe that what is unique in European case is that we shouldn't give up on the soft power that European Union represents. What we need to find is the line where we need to strengthen our European pillar in NATO. I think that this debate should, at the beginning at least, be that we need to have a complementarities. NATO proved to be very successful when it comes to providing collective security to all of us here, to provide the security umbrella. And this question of European strategic autonomy, I think, should be framed by our interest to maintaining and protecting the transatlantic bond. However, I think that it's important that Europe has capacity to act, especially where in areas where, for example, the United States are not interested in acting, and Africa, southern eastern neighborhood are areas where we need to be able to project more stability, to project through hard power, also our interests, and help to tackle some of the challenges these areas are facing, because in the long run, and it was mentioned, the big problems are outside of the EU. We are probably squabbling internally, but the tectonic changes will take place in Africa, in Asia, outside of our borders. And in order to be ready, we need to have a capacity to act in these regions.
Thank you. Madam Placio?
Well, very, very short. First, I think that we Europeans, we are self-criticizing ourselves in the sense that we always feel a certain awkwardness between the NATO and the European defense. It shouldn't be that the way. I mean, NATO, it's important for all of us Europeans. A more robust, a strategic autonomy of the European Union should not be perceived, especially not by us Europeans, as in contradiction with NATO. There are other aspects on which I'm quite critical. I don't think that you can speak today of a European army without confusing the citizens. We are not there, and it's not a need. Can we project? Yes, we can. I mean, of course we can. As European Union, we have missions. As PESCO, which is 24 of the 28 member states, we are there, and we are building the agency to be able to have also a certain European autonomy in the area of industry. And this is something on which we have to push forward, and that I hope that we will push forward. And frankly, we cannot allow allies in the United States, because this is in the end, this is the elephant in the room. Yes, we want to have one combat and not 15. Yes, we are entitled. And yes, maybe we will buy less of, but we need to build on this, and we are still committed to NATO. We are still really behind United States, and we acknowledge that in many areas, and this was clear in Libya, for instance. But my concluding is what I said at the beginning. We cannot, as Europeans, start by saying, well, we cannot afford. No, there is no contradiction. We are NATO. We want NATO. We trust NATO. NATO is essential for us, but a certain strategic autonomy, as I say, in certain areas, without being grandiloquent and speaking about the European army, which I think confuses the people around us.
Thank you. Madam Semerkeni.
Thank you so much for this question. I think it is really one of the most important sort of strategic question to understand properly. I definitely see that at the beginning of this era of great power competition that we can see unfolding already, there is no way that either the European Union or the United States can go forward protecting their values separately. There's no other more important fundamental priority than the cooperation on the transatlantic level. And I very much believe that all the steps that strengthen the European nations of the transatlantic community are promoting and helping this to come about. The stronger cooperation, that makes perfect sense. Ultimately, just as the minister said, just as Anna said, this is a challenge to cooperate together and to see these challenges together and to strengthen the defenses that we have for the transatlantic community. The question, of course, the challenge is, are we going to be able to manage the insertion of the resurgence or raising China into this international system in a peaceful and cooperative way through defending our values and interests?
Thank you. Pavel?
Well, EU-NATO cooperation has never been better. It sounds like a bit of a slogan, but actually EU-NATO cooperation has never been better. It is currently in full swing when it comes to the whole range of issues, including hybrid threats. Yes, 15 years ago, at the time of Iraq war, there were ideas in Europe about creating some sort of parallel structures, but I mean, to be honest, I haven't heard anyone of importance and standing and serious mind mention that for years now. So I think we can safely assume that it belongs to the past. And defense has been a growth industry in the past 5 years. In the past 3 years, I suppose, to be more precise, because when Michel Barnier arrived as President Juncker's defense advisor, he actually sat with our unit, the EPSC, because there was no place for him to sit at the Commission. There was no DG Defense, and there is no DG Defense for the moment. But ever since, this project has really taken off. And there were a lot of people saying that it's not going to work, that the interests are too different for this to work, but it has. And the PESCO modules that Minister Palapio mentioned, the second round is much more ambitious than the first round, so we are moving. The European Defence Fund is being created with 13 billion euro proposed for the next financial perspective. I mean, this will be a game changer, because this will be the biggest spending item for research and development in Europe. So this will make a difference. And of course, some countries, France in particular, are putting more emphasis on operational capabilities. And there is merit in that. I think in the current circumstances, we simply need all hands on deck. And one shouldn't be purist in distinguishing whether this is communitarian or intergovernmental. We need to combine efforts.
Ladies and gentlemen, despite the limited time we had, I think we touched upon some important issues. I mean, emotional, philosophical, sociological foundations. We talked about hard power, about the legal issues. So it's actually a good foretaste. This panel was a good foretaste of what is ahead of us during the Prague European Summit. And I would like really to thank to our panelists for their contribution. I would like to thank to all of you for your contribution, for your attention, for your questions, for your comments. Just small organizational remark. The ceremony which will be awarded and the reception, all these things take place in the garden. So you will be accompanied by the interns which are here to the garden. So thank you very much and see you in the garden quite soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.